The convention center buzzed with the familiar energy of a Saturday afternoon tattoo expo. Artists hunched over their stations, needles humming against skin while observers wandered between booths, admiring flash art and watching transformations unfold in real time. The air carried the distinct mixture of antiseptic, ink, and nervous excitement that marked such gatherings. Dr. Sarah Chen had never been to a tattoo convention before. As a cultural anthropologist specializing in modern rituals and body modification, she had studied the practice extensively through academic papers and interviews, but never witnessed it firsthand. Her research grant had specifically allocated funds for what she termed participant observation, though she had no intention of becoming a participant herself. She was here to observe, document, and understand the social dynamics that made tattoo conventions such powerful community gatherings. Moving through the crowd with her notebook and recording device, Sarah found herself fascinated by the transformation occurring around her. This wasn't merely about decorating skin, it was about identity, belonging, and the deeply human need to mark significant moments in permanent ways. She watched as nervous first-timers clutched design printouts while seasoned collectors compared pieces like living galleries. The demographics surprised her. Contrary to outdated stereotypes, she observed professionals in business attire scheduling appointments alongside college students, elderly individuals showing off decades-old pieces, and families sharing the experience across generations. The convention had become a mainstream cultural event, no longer confined to society's margins. As she documented these observations, Sarah noticed a particular corner of the convention that seemed to draw more attention than the rest. A small crowd had gathered around a single artist's booth, not cheering or chatting as was common elsewhere, but standing in respectful silence. The energy felt different, more intense, almost reverent. Curiosity overtook her academic detachment, and she made her way toward the gathering. As she approached, the crowd parted slightly, offering her a clear view of what had captured everyone's attention. In the center sat a man who appeared to be in his 30s, lean but muscular, with prematurely gray streaks in his dark hair. His back was exposed to the artist, but it was his chest that had stunned the observers into silence. Across his torso, from collarbone to sternum, stretched an intricate tattoo that defied easy categorization. It wasn't the typical bold lines and solid colors of traditional tattooing, nor was it the photorealistic portraits that had gained popularity. Instead, it appeared to be a map of scars, but these weren't actual scars. They were perfectly rendered in ink, creating the illusion of healed wounds that told a story of survival and transformation. The centerpiece was a phrase written in elegant script along his sternum: "The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others." Below it, spreading across his ribs like branches of a tree, were smaller inscriptions in various languages, what appeared to be Arabic, Sanskrit, Hebrew, and others Sarah couldn't immediately identify. Each seemed to reinforce the central message, creating a multilingual testament to resilience. But it was the artistic rendering that truly captured attention. The scars weren't depicted as fresh wounds but as fully healed marks that had become beautiful. Some were rendered to look like they had been transformed into flowering vines, others into geometric patterns that suggested both damage and repair. The overall effect was of a man who had taken his deepest vulnerabilities and turned them into his greatest strength. Sarah found herself holding her breath. In 20 years of studying cultural practices, she had never seen body art that so powerfully communicated a philosophical stance. This wasn't decoration or rebellion, it was a manifesto written in skin. The man seemed oblivious to the crowd's attention. His eyes were closed, and his breathing was deep and measured as the artist continued working on his back. Sarah noticed that his hands, resting on his knees, bore small tattoos as well, symbols that looked like they might represent stages of a journey or transformation. "First time seeing Marcus," whispered a woman beside Sarah. She was perhaps 50, with intricate sleeve tattoos that marked her as someone deeply embedded in the community. Sarah nodded, not wanting to break the reverent atmosphere with conversation, but the woman continued in low tones. "He comes every year. Different artist each time, but always adding to the same story. Been documenting his recovery for about 5 years now." The word recovery hung in the air, loaded with implication. Sarah wanted to ask more, but something about the scene demanded silence. This was clearly more than a tattoo session, it was a ritual, a ceremony of transformation that the gathered observers understood and respected even if they couldn't articulate why. As the artist worked, Sarah noticed the incredible skill involved. Each mark was precisely placed, the shading creating depth that made the scars appear three-dimensional. The text was rendered in a hand that suggested calligraphy training, with each letter perfectly formed. This wasn't the work of someone randomly chosen, this was collaboration between the canvas and a master craftsperson. The back piece being completed appeared to be a phoenix rising from flames, but rendered in the same scarred aesthetic as the chest piece. The flames looked like keloid formations, and the phoenix's wings were composed of what appeared to be torn and mended skin. Yet somehow, the overall effect was triumphant rather than tragic. It suggested not just survival, but transformation through adversity. Sarah began to understand why the crowd maintained such respectful silence. They were witnessing something profound, a man literally inscribing his philosophy of resilience onto his body, creating a permanent reminder of his commitment to growth over defeat. The tattoo wasn't just art, it was armor, manifesto, and memorial all at once. The hours passed unnoticed as Sarah remained transfixed. She watched as passers-by stopped, observed, and left clearly moved by what they had witnessed. Some left quietly, others whispered among themselves, but none treated it as mere spectacle. There was an recognition of something sacred occurring, a transformation ritual that transcended the usual boundaries between observer and participant. As the session neared completion, Sarah realized she had filled nearly 30 pages of notes without conscious effort. Her academic training had taken over, documenting not just what she saw but the crowd's reaction, the artist's technique, and her own response to witnessing such raw authenticity. This wasn't just a tattoo convention anymore, it had become a masterclass in human resilience and the power of symbolic transformation. The artist finally lifted the needle and stepped back. Marcus opened his eyes for the first time in hours, and Sarah could see in them a clarity and peace that suggested the session had been as much meditation as decoration. He looked down at his completed back piece in a handheld mirror, nodded once to the artist, and began the careful process of cleaning and protecting the fresh work. As he prepared to leave, several people approached to thank him, not for the entertainment, but for something deeper. Sarah heard fragments of conversation. "Thank you for showing us, that gave me strength, I understand now." It became clear that Marcus's presence at these conventions served a purpose beyond personal expression. He had become, perhaps inadvertently, a living example of transformation through adversity. When the crowd finally began to disperse, Sarah found herself face to face with Marcus as he pulled on his shirt. Up close, she could see that his face bore the same quality of peaceful resolution as his body art, the look of someone who had fought internal battles and emerged victorious not through conquest, but through integration of his struggles into his strength. "Excuse me," she said, introducing herself and explaining her research. "Would you be willing to talk about your experience? What I witnessed here today was unlike anything in my academic study of body modification culture." Marcus considered her request carefully. "The tattoos speak for themselves," he said finally. "But, if it helps others understand that we all have the power to transform our pain into purpose, I'm willing to share the story." And so began Sarah's education in a form of resilience she had never encountered in textbooks, the deliberate destruction of one's weak self as a path to unshakable strength. Part 2, The Philosophy of Intentional Destruction. 3 weeks later, Sarah met Marcus at a quiet coffee shop away from the spectacle of the convention. She had spent the intervening time researching everything she could find about trauma recovery, resilience psychology, and the therapeutic use of body modification. Nothing had prepared her for the depth of philosophical consideration Marcus brought to his practice. "The phrase 'on my chest' isn't original to me," he began, settling into his chair with careful movement that suggested recent tattoo healing. "It's adapted from various sources: Stoic philosophy, Buddhist teachings, even some modern psychology. But the core idea is that our greatest enemy is often the version of ourselves that accepts defeat, that believes we are forever defined by what happens to us rather than how we respond to it." Sarah's recorder captured his words, but she found herself taking extensive notes anyway, trying to capture not just the content but the measured way he spoke, like someone who had given deep consideration to every concept he expressed. "Most people think of destruction as inherently negative," Marcus continued. "But destruction can be a creative act if it's intentional and directed toward what no longer serves us. A sculptor destroys the excess marble to reveal the statue within. A gardener prunes dead branches so the tree can flourish. The weak self, the part that says we can't overcome, can't grow, can't transform, that part needs to be deliberately destroyed. Sarah interrupted gently. The woman at the convention mentioned recovery. Are you referring to addiction recovery specifically? Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his hands wrapped around his coffee cup in a way that suggested this was a practiced meditation. Addiction was part of it, but not the whole story. I was in a car accident 7 years ago. Drunk driver, ironically, not me. I was actually 6 months sober at the time, working hard to rebuild my life after losing everything to alcoholism. The accident put me in a coma for 2 weeks and left me with chronic pain that the doctor said would never fully resolve. He paused, and Sarah could see him choosing his words carefully. When I woke up, I had 2 choices. I could let this new trauma define me, become the victim of both my addiction and someone else's poor choices, or I could destroy the part of myself that wanted to surrender to that narrative. The tattoos began as a way to mark the choice visually, permanently. The scars on your chest, they're not real scars from the accident? No. The accident left me with internal injuries but no external scarring. These, he gestured to his chest, are the scars I chose to bear. They represent every moment I decided to transform pain into strength, every time I destroyed a little more of the victim mentality that wanted to take root. Sarah found herself reconsidering everything she thought she understood about body modification. So the tattooing process itself is part of the philosophy? The voluntary acceptance of pain? Exactly. But it's not about masochism or proving toughness. It's about practicing intentional discomfort in service of growth. Every session in that chair is an opportunity to sit with pain and not let it control my response. It's meditation through ordeal, if that makes sense. It did make sense, Sarah realized. Marcus had created a practice that combined physical endurance, artistic expression, and philosophical commitment into a unified discipline. The tattoos weren't just decoration, they were the visible result of a methodical approach to personal transformation. Tell me about the text in multiple languages. Is that significant beyond the aesthetic? Marcus smiled for the first time during their conversation. I spent 2 years after the accident studying different wisdom traditions, looking for perspectives on suffering and transformation. What I found was that every culture has developed some version of this idea, that our responses to hardship define us more than the hardships themselves. The Sanskrit phrase translates roughly to "the lotus blooms in mud." The Arabic text is from a Sufi teaching about polishing the mirror of the heart. The Hebrew is from a Talmudic discussion about the necessity of breaking vessels to receive new light. Sarah was scribbling rapidly now, fascinated by the scholarly depth of his approach. So you're creating a synthesis of different philosophical traditions? More like finding the common thread. The specific wisdom traditions matter less than the universal recognition that transformation requires the conscious destruction of our limiting beliefs about ourselves. The weak self is the part of us that accepts the story that we're powerless, that we're forever damaged, that our past determines our future. And the artwork itself, the way the scars are rendered as beautiful, integrated into natural forms? That's the key insight. The goal isn't to pretend trauma never happened or to minimize its impact. It's to transform it into something that strengthens rather than diminishes us. The scars become beautiful not by denying their scars, but by choosing what story they tell. Marcus pulled up his sleeve to show Sarah one of the smaller pieces she had noticed at the convention. On his forearm was a single word in elegant script, Phoenix. Below it, in smaller text that required closer inspection to read, was a date, the day of his accident. Every year on this date, I add something new to the collection. Not to commemorate the trauma, but to celebrate another year of choosing transformation over victimhood. The phoenix isn't just a symbol of rising from ashes, it's a symbol of choosing to burn away what no longer serves you so that something stronger can emerge. Sarah set down her pen and looked directly at Marcus. What you're describing sounds like a complete philosophical system, not just a coping mechanism. Have you considered writing about this approach? The body is the text, he replied. Words can be argued with, rationalized away, forgotten. But these marks are a constant reminder of the choice I make every day to destroy my weak self and build something stronger. They're also a challenge to others who see them to consider their own relationship with adversity. Is that why you tattoo publicly at conventions? As a form of teaching? Marcus considered this carefully. I started going to conventions just to find artists skilled enough to execute the vision. But I realized that doing the work publicly serves a purpose I hadn't anticipated. People see someone voluntarily enduring pain in service of transformation, and it challenges their assumptions about what's possible for them. Not everyone needs to get tattoos, but everyone needs to find ways to deliberately destroy their limiting beliefs about themselves. Sarah found herself thinking about her own relationship with discomfort, her tendency to avoid challenges that might reveal her limitations. What does this practice require from someone who wants to adopt it? What are the prerequisites? Honesty, mostly. You have to be willing to acknowledge the parts of yourself that are holding you back, the victim stories, the excuses, the beliefs about your own powerlessness. And you have to be willing to let those parts die. That's often harder than it sounds because these patterns become comfortable even when they're destructive. And the tattoos specifically, are they essential to the practice? For me, yes. But others might find different ways to make the commitment visible and permanent. The key is that it has to cost something: time, money, comfort, ego. Transformation without sacrifice is just positive thinking. Real change requires that you burn the boats, make retreat impossible. Sarah realized that what she was documenting went far beyond body modification culture. Marcus had developed a practical philosophy of resilience that challenged conventional approaches to trauma recovery and personal development. Where traditional therapy often focused on healing wounds, his approach emphasized transforming wounds into sources of strength. Have you connected with others who practice similar approaches? There's a growing community, though it's not organized in any formal way. People who found ways to transform their relationship with adversity, to see challenges as opportunities for strengthening rather than threats to endure. Athletes understand this intuitively. They know that muscle grows only when it's stressed beyond its current capacity. The same principle applies to character, to resilience, to every aspect of personal development. As their conversation continued, Sarah began to see the broader implications of Marcus's philosophy. In a culture that often promoted comfort-seeking and risk aversion, he had discovered a path to strength through voluntary adversity. His tattoos weren't just personal art, they were a manifesto for a different way of engaging with life's inevitable challenges. One more question, Sarah said as they prepared to leave. What would you say to someone who sees your approach as extreme or unnecessary? Who thinks that accepting oneself as you are is healthier than constantly seeking to destroy parts of yourself? Marcus smiled again, this time with a hint of the mischief Sarah had seen in his eyes at the convention. I'd say they're confusing self-acceptance with self-limitation. Accepting yourself includes accepting your capacity to grow, to change, to become stronger than you were yesterday. The weak self isn't who you are, it's who you've settled for being. Destroying it isn't self-harm, it's self-liberation. Part 3, The Ripple Effect of Radical Authenticity. 6 months after their initial meeting, Sarah received an unexpected call from Marcus. His voice carried an excitement she hadn't heard before as he invited her to witness something he described as the natural evolution of the practice. He was speaking at a conference on alternative approaches to trauma recovery, and he wanted her to document how the philosophy they had discussed was spreading beyond individual practice into community healing. The conference was held at a wellness center outside the city, drawing participants from diverse backgrounds: therapists, social workers, military veterans, addiction counselors, and individuals seeking alternative approaches to personal healing. Sarah arrived early and found Marcus setting up a presentation that looked unlike any academic talk she had ever seen. Instead of PowerPoint slides, he had arranged a series of large mirrors around the speaking area. Each mirror had a single word etched into its surface, words like victim, powerless, broken, worthless, hopeless. At the center of the arrangement stood an empty chair and a small table holding what appeared to be art supplies. Welcome to a demonstration of intentional destruction, Marcus began as the audience settled into their seats. Sarah noticed that many participants looked skeptical, even uncomfortable with the setup. These were professionals accustomed to careful, evidence-based approaches to healing, not performance art. For the past 3 years, I've been working with individuals who found traditional therapy helpful but incomplete, Marcus continued. They've processed their trauma, understood its origins, even learned healthy coping mechanisms. But they've remained trapped in stories about their limitations, still seeing themselves through the lens of what was done to them rather than what they've chosen to do in response. He gestured to the mirrors surrounding the space. These words represent the weak self, the internal voice that says we are forever defined by our worst moments, our greatest failures, our deepest wounds. Today, we're going to practice destroying that voice. A woman in the front row raised her hand. Are you suggesting that people need to destroy parts of their identity? That seems psychologically dangerous. I'm suggesting that people need to destroy the parts of their identity that keep them weak, Marcus replied. There's a difference between your trauma and your relationship to your trauma. We're not erasing history, we're choosing how history will shape our future. He moved to the center of the space and sat in the chair facing the mirror labeled powerless. I spent 5 years believing that my addiction and my accident had made me fundamentally damaged. I went to therapy, I worked the steps, I did everything right according to conventional wisdom. But I was still living from a place of I am someone who was hurt rather than I am someone who has transformed hurt into strength. Using a marker from the table, he began drawing directly on the mirror, covering the word powerless with bold strokes. The weak self believes that acknowledging powerlessness is the end of the story. The strong self recognizes that acknowledging powerlessness is the beginning, it's the starting point for discovering what power we do have. As he worked, something shifted in the room's energy. The skeptical murmurs died away, replaced by intent attention. Sarah noticed several participants leaning forward, as if drawn by something they couldn't quite articulate. Who among you has a word that describes how you see yourself at your weakest? Marcus asked, setting down the marker and looking around the room. A word that represents the story you tell yourself about why you can't overcome, can't grow, can't become who you're meant to be? The silence stretched uncomfortably long before a middle-aged man near the back spoke up. Failure. I see myself as someone who always fails at the things that matter most. Come up here, Marcus invited. Let's destroy that together. The man approached hesitantly, and Marcus guided him to the mirror labeled worthless, close enough, he explained, to represent the feeling of failure. Tell me about the story, Marcus said as he handed the man a different colored marker. How did you become convinced that you are failure rather than someone who has had failures? What followed was a 20-minute conversation that was part therapy session, part artistic collaboration, and part spiritual practice. As the man shared his story of career setbacks, relationship disappointments, and mounting self-doubt, he began drawing on the mirror, first tentatively, then with increasing boldness. The weak self says that because you've failed, you are failure, Marcus observed. What would the strong self say? That I'm someone who's learning, the man replied, his voice gaining strength. That each failure taught me something I needed to know for the next attempt. By the time he finished, the mirror was covered with a complex design that had transformed the word worthless into part of a larger artistic statement about resilience and growth. The man stepped back, looking surprised by his own creation. How do you feel? Marcus asked. Different, the man said slowly. Like I've been carrying around this heavy story about myself, and I just set it down. Sarah was documenting frantically, but she found herself as moved as the rest of the audience. What she was witnessing wasn't traditional therapy or academic lecture, it was something more like a ritual of transformation that combined psychological insight with artistic expression and community witness. Over the next 2 hours, 6 more participants worked with the mirrors, each transforming a word that represented their limiting self-concept into part of a larger artistic statement about growth and possibility. The room filled with the energy of people discovering that their relationship to their own stories was more fluid than they had imagined. But it was the final demonstration that provided Sarah with the clearest understanding of how Marcus's philosophy was evolving beyond individual practice. He invited everyone present to stand around the mirrors and share one word that represented something they wanted to destroy about their weak self and one word that represented what they wanted to create in its place. What emerged was a collective recognition that everyone present was engaged in the same fundamental work, choosing how their life experiences would shape their identity. The specific details varied, but the underlying challenge was universal. Would they be defined by what happened to them, or by how they chose to respond to what happened to them? As the formal presentation ended, something unexpected occurred. People began approaching Marcus not to congratulate him or ask questions, but to share their own stories of transformation and to describe practices they had developed for deliberately destroying limiting beliefs about themselves. A veteran spoke about using extreme physical challenges as a way of proving to himself that he was stronger than his PTSD. A social worker described how she had started each day by symbolically burying one fear or excuse that kept her from serving her clients more effectively. Sarah realized she was witnessing the emergence of a movement, not an organized one with formal leadership, but a spontaneous recognition among diverse individuals that conventional approaches to healing and growth, while valuable, were incomplete without the element of intentional destruction of self-limiting beliefs. During a break, she approached Dr. Jennifer Martinez, a trauma therapist who had been taking extensive notes throughout the presentation. "What's your professional assessment of what we just witnessed?" Dr. Martinez considered carefully before responding. "Traditional therapy excels at helping people understand and process their trauma. But Marcus is addressing something we often don't talk about explicitly: the way people become attached to their trauma narratives as part of their identity. He's providing a framework for helping people choose empowerment over victimhood without minimizing the reality of what they've experienced." "Do you see risks in this approach?" "Certainly. It could be misused to shame people for struggling or to suggest that trauma responses are simply choices to be overcome. But, when practiced with the kind of philosophical depth and community support I've seen here today, it offers something many people need: permission to outgrow the stories that keep them small." As the day concluded, Marcus made an announcement that surprised even Sarah. He was launching what he called the Phoenix Project, not an organization or program, but a loose network of individuals committed to supporting each other in the practice of intentional transformation. The only requirements for participation were commitment to destroying one's weak self and willingness to help others do the same. "The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others," he reminded the group, "because he has already done the hardest work himself." But this practice is not meant to be done alone. We become strong individuals in community with other strong individuals. Over the following months, Sarah documented the growth of the Phoenix Project through social media, local meetups, and informal networks of people who had adopted various forms of intentional adversity as a path to strength. She watched as the basic philosophy adapted to different contexts: business leaders using it to overcome fear of failure, parents using it to model resilience for their children, students using it to transform academic challenges into opportunities for growth. What struck her most was how the practice created a different type of community than traditional support groups. Instead of bonding over shared wounds, Phoenix Project participants bonded over shared commitment to transformation. Instead of finding comfort in commiseration, they found strength in mutual challenge and accountability. The tattoo conventions remained important to Marcus personally, but they had become just one venue among many where the philosophy was expressed and shared. Sarah documented people creating art, writing poetry, engaging in physical challenges, starting businesses, and pursuing dreams they had previously considered impossible, all as expressions of their commitment to destroying the weak self that said such things were beyond their reach. A year after their first meeting, Sarah completed her research with a final interview with Marcus. By then, his body art had evolved to include elements contributed by others in the Phoenix Project, small additions that represented the community aspect of transformation, the recognition that individual strength was enhanced rather than diminished by connection with others engaged in similar work. "What have you learned about the practice that you didn't expect when you started?" she asked. "That destruction is creative, but it's also contagious," he replied. "When people see someone who has genuinely transformed their relationship to adversity, it gives them permission to attempt the same transformation. The weak self thrives in isolation, convinced that growth is impossible. But the strong self emerges in community, inspired by evidence that change is not only possible but happening all around us." Sarah left that final interview understanding that she had documented something more significant than an alternative therapy technique or artistic movement. She had witnessed the emergence of a practical philosophy that addressed one of the most fundamental challenges of human existence: how to transform inevitable suffering into voluntary strength. The phrase, "the man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others," had evolved from personal motto to community principle to cultural movement. But, at its heart remained Marcus's original insight, that we have more power over our internal response to external circumstances than we typically realize, and that exercising that power requires the courage to deliberately destroy the parts of ourselves that prefer victimhood to victory. In her final report, Sarah wrote, "What I observed was not just body modification or alternative therapy, but the emergence of a new form of spiritual practice adapted to contemporary challenges." Participants were not seeking to escape their humanity but to fully claim it, including their capacity to grow beyond their current limitations. They had discovered that the question is not whether we will face adversity, but whether we will allow adversity to make us stronger or weaker. The choice, they had learned, is always ours. The tattoo that had stunned everyone into silence had become a conversation that was spreading far beyond the convention center walls, challenging people everywhere to consider their own relationship with the transformative power of intentional destruction and conscious reconstruction of the self. Marcus had not just decorated his body, he had created a living philosophy that invited others to discover their own capacity for radical transformation through the deliberate destruction of everything that kept them smaller than they were meant to become.